The Mediterranean of the 2nd century BCE was a world in flux, a vast chessboard where kingdoms, city-states, and empires jostled for influence. Once, Alexander the Great had united much of the known world under his sword, carrying Macedonian power from Greece to Egypt and as far as India. His death in 323 BCE, however, fractured that colossal empire into fragments, leaving his generals, the Diadochus, scrambling for dominion. Out of the chaos, kingdoms arose. The Seleucids in the east, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedon. Macedon, though smaller than Alexander's former empire, remained proud and powerful. Its phalanx, a wall of spears bristling with iron, was legendary. For centuries, it had been the weapon of kings, the shield of Greek independence, and the nightmare of enemies. Yet, while Macedon held its ground in the east, another power stirred in the west. Rome, once just a city on the banks of the Tiber, had grown into a republic of formidable strength. Through a series of brutal wars against Carthage, the Romans had forged themselves into masters of Italy and beyond. Their legions were disciplined, flexible, and unyielding. In them, Rome possessed a weapon that would eclipse even the phalanx. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the destinies of Rome and Macedon were on a collision course. The Mediterranean was not large enough for two masters. The roots of the Rome-Macedonian conflict lay deep in ambition and fear. Rome had already faced Macedon in earlier wars, each sparked by shifting alliances and the growing suspicion that Macedon sought to challenge Rome's expanding dominance. When Philip V of Macedon allied himself with Hannibal of Carthage during the Second Punic War, Rome had taken note. Though Philip's support was limited, it was enough to paint Macedon as a potential threat. By 179 BCE, Philip's son Perseus inherited the throne. Perseus was no ordinary king. He was shrewd, charismatic, and determined to restore Macedonian glory. He courted allies across Greece and beyond, seeking to strengthen his hand against Rome. His marriage to Laodice, the daughter of the Seleucid king, signaled his ambitions for wider influence. Rome, watching carefully, grew uneasy. The Senate feared a revival of Macedonian power and the formation of an anti-Roman alliance stretching from Greece to Asia Minor. In their eyes, Perseus was a spark that could ignite a blaze. Tensions rose, accusations flew, and soon the stage was set for yet another war, the Third Macedonian War. The year was 171 BCE when Rome formally declared war. The Senate dispatched its legions eastward, confident in their superiority but cautious of Macedon's formidable phalanx. Perseus rallied his forces, drawing on the loyalty of Macedon's people and allies. For years, the conflict dragged on, marked by skirmishes, maneuvers, and political intrigue. Perseus scored early successes. At Callinicus, his phalanx held firm, repelling Roman attacks and reminding the world that Macedon was no easy prey. But Rome was relentless. Unlike the monarchies of the East, Rome's strength lay not in one man, but in the collective will of its Senate and its citizens. Defeat could be avenged, losses replaced, and generals rotated until victory was achieved. By 168 BCE, command of the Roman forces fell to Lucius Aemilius Paullus, an experienced general of noble character. Paullus understood the strengths and weaknesses of both armies. He knew that the phalanx, though terrifying and unbroken, was unwieldy on rough terrain. The Roman legion, by contrast, thrived in flexibility, its manipular formations capable of adapting to any circumstance. The two forces met near the Macedonian city of Pydna in the shadow of Mount Olympus. The battle that followed would not only decide the fate of Macedon, but also reshape the course of Mediterranean history. The afternoon sun blazed over the hills as the Roman legions and Macedonian phalanx assembled. Dust rose from the ground, mingling with the clamor of shields, spears, and swords. Paullus, mounted on his horse, surveyed the field with calm precision. Across from him, Perseus stood proud ahead of his army, his phalanx stretched like an iron wall, its sarissas gleaming in the light. The battle began with a thunderous advance. The Macedonian phalanx surged forward, a forest of spears bristling against the Roman line. For a time, the Romans struggled. The sheer weight and reach of the sarissas drove them back, the ground trembling under the press of shields. Paullus himself later admitted he feared the day was lost. But fate intervened. The ground near Pydna was uneven, cut with ridges and gullies. As the phalanx advanced, its formation began to break. Gaps opened between the ranks as soldiers stumbled over the rough terrain. The iron wall was no longer unbroken. Seizing the moment, Paullus gave the order. The Roman maniples darted into the gaps, their short swords, gladii, flashing in the sun. Face-to-face combat erupted, and here the Macedonians faltered. Their long spears were useless at close quarters, while the Romans, shield to shield, hacked their way through. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Macedonian soldiers fell by the thousands, their once proud phalanx collapsing into chaos. Perseus fled, abandoning his men to their fate. By nightfall, the field was littered with bodies, and Macedon's power was broken. The Battle of Pydna was decisive. In a single afternoon, Macedon's centuries-old dominance was shattered. Rome dismantled the kingdom, dividing it into 4 republics under Roman oversight. Perseus, captured and paraded through Rome in chains, was a living testament to Macedon's fall. For Greece, the consequences were profound. Many city-states that had once looked to Macedon for protection now found themselves at the mercy of Rome. The balance of power that had defined the Hellenistic world since Alexander was gone. A new order was emerging, one in which Rome was supreme. For Rome, the victory at Pydna was more than just a triumph over a rival. It was a declaration that Rome was no longer a regional power, but the arbiter of the Mediterranean. The legions had proven themselves against the phalanx, and in doing so, they had secured the foundations of an empire that would endure for centuries. The fall of Macedon marked the end of an era. The phalanx, once the terror of the ancient world, had been humbled by the discipline and flexibility of the Roman legion. The eastern Mediterranean, once divided among rival kingdoms, now fell steadily under Roman influence. In the decades that followed, Rome extended its reach further, absorbing Greece, Asia Minor, and beyond. The cultural treasures of Greece enriched Rome, even as Rome's political dominance reshaped the ancient world. The Battle of Pydna was more than a clash of armies, it was a turning point in history. It showed that no kingdom, however glorious its past, could withstand the relentless march of Roman power. The destinies of Rome and Macedon had collided on that battlefield, and out of the dust and blood, a new world was born. In the years leading up to Pydna, the Macedonian court was a place of anxious whispers and restless ambition. Perseus, seated on the throne of his ancestors, often walked the marble halls of Pella in silence, his mind weighed down by both pride and dread. Macedon was still strong, but Perseus knew strength alone did not guarantee survival. Rome's shadow stretched longer with every passing year, swallowing allies and rivals alike. At council meetings, his generals urged caution. Some advised that he should seek peace to avoid the wrath of the Roman Senate. But Perseus was not content to bow. If Macedon is to live, it must live proud, he declared one evening, his voice echoing through the chamber. Our fathers did not win freedom by submission. Shall we throw away their glory now? Meanwhile, in Rome, the Senate debated with equal fervor. Voices rose in the Curia as senators weighed the risks of another war in Greece. Some argued that Macedon was too far to threaten Rome directly, that the Republic should consolidate its hold in Italy and the West. But others, veterans of the Punic Wars, warned that no threat could be ignored. Did we not suffer Hannibal because we underestimated him? One senator thundered. Shall we wait until Perseus gathers all Greece under his banner? The decision was made. Rome would not wait. The years of war that followed were not only fought with spears and swords, but with treaties, betrayals, and whispered promises. Greek city-states, torn between pride and pragmatism, found themselves caught in the storm. Some sided with Rome, hoping to preserve autonomy under Roman favor. Others clung to Macedon, seeing in Perseus a last chance to resist Roman domination. Envoys traveled constantly between courts, their words dripping with persuasion and deceit. At one meeting in Athens, a Roman ambassador warned the assembly of the dangers of trusting Perseus. "He speaks of freedom," the envoy said, "but what he offers is merely a change of master. Rome does not enslave. Rome protects." Yet Macedonian agents moved just as swiftly. In Corinth, one of Perseus's men stood before a gathering of citizens and declared, "Do you think Rome comes as a friend? No, they come as conquerors. Today they demand tribute, tomorrow your very sons and daughters." And it was in this division that Rome found its advantage. By the summer of 1680 CE, the two armies had drawn close. In the Roman camp, Lucius Aemilius Paullus walked among his soldiers on the night before the great battle. Torches flickered in the darkness as the legionaries sharpened their blades, repaired their shields, and murmured quiet prayers to the gods. Paullus spoke with calm authority, his words steadying the hearts of his men. "Tomorrow," he told them, "we face a wall of iron, a forest of spears. Do not fear their length, for the hand that holds them can falter. Trust in your discipline, trust in the strength of the legion, and the gods will favor us." Across the plain, Perseus addressed his Macedonians. He stood before the phalanx, thousands of men arrayed in gleaming armor, their sarissas thrust toward the sky like 1,000 lightning bolts. "Sons of Macedon," he cried, "you carry the legacy of Alexander. Tomorrow we show the world that the spirit of Greece cannot be broken. Rome fights for greed, but we fight for our homes, for our freedom, for glory." The soldiers roared their approval, but in the silence of his tent later that night, Perseus could not escape a gnawing sense of dread. He had seen the Romans fall. He knew their persistence, their adaptability, and though his army was strong, he wondered if destiny itself had turned against Macedon. The dawn broke with a crimson sky, as though the heavens themselves foretold the blood that would soon soak the earth. The Macedonian phalanx advanced in perfect rhythm, the ground trembling beneath their march. Shield against shield, spear against spear, they seemed unstoppable. At first, the Romans struggled. Legionaries fell as the sarissas drove relentlessly into their ranks. Paullus watched anxiously, his hands clenched tightly around the reins of his horse. "Hold the line," he shouted. "Bide your time." Came the moment fate intervened. The rugged terrain of Pydna began to tear the phalanx apart. Small streams, gullies, and uneven ground forced the tight formation to break. Gaps appeared like cracks in stone, and into those cracks the Romans poured like water. With short swords flashing, the legionaries cut down the Macedonians at close range. Shield met shield, sword met flesh. The battlefield rang with the cries of the dying and the clash of steel. Perseus, seeing the collapse of his proud phalanx, felt his courage falter. Instead of rallying his men, he fled the field, abandoning them to slaughter. For the Macedonian soldiers, it was a betrayal they would never forget. By nightfall, over 20,000 Macedonians lay dead. The once proud phalanx was reduced to corpses and broken spears. Rome had triumphed. In the months that followed, the consequences of Pydna rippled across the Mediterranean. Perseus was captured and taken to Rome. During Paullus's triumphal procession, the defeated king was paraded in chains, his head bowed in humiliation as Roman citizens cheered. For the Republic, it was a moment of glory. For Macedon, a tragedy beyond words. Plutarch later recorded how Perseus wept not for his lost throne, but for the humiliation of seeing his children marched in captivity. His dynasty was ended, his kingdom carved into pieces under Roman control. Macedon was divided into 4 puppet republics, each forbidden from intermarrying or trading freely with the others. It was a deliberate humiliation, designed to erase Macedon's power forever. The fall of Macedon sent shockwaves across Greece. In Athens, philosophers debated whether Rome's dominance was a blessing or a curse. Some saw Rome as the inheritor of Greek culture, a power that would spread Hellenism even farther. Others saw only the loss of freedom. In Sparta, an old warrior spat on the ground when he heard the news. "So the great Macedon has fallen," he muttered. "Perhaps we should have stood with them, for soon our turn will come." In Corinth, merchants whispered uneasily. Rome's dominance meant new markets, but also new taxes and oversight. Freedom was a word that seemed to shrink with every passing year. For Rome, the victory was intoxicating. The Republic had humbled one of the greatest powers of the Hellenistic world. Soldiers returned laden with spoils, generals with new honors. The Senate basked in glory, but beneath the triumph lay a subtle transformation. Rome was no longer simply defending itself, it was conquering. Each new victory pulled the Republic further into the affairs of the East. The wealth of Macedon poured into Rome, funding grand temples, lavish games, and political ambitions. But with wealth came corruption. Some senators grew fat with bribes and spoils. Ordinary citizens, dazzled by plunder, demanded more wars to keep the riches flowing. A cycle had begun, one that would eventually transform the Republic into an empire. The Battle of Pydna marked the end of Macedonian independence, but its legacy stretched far beyond the battlefield. It demonstrated the superiority of the Roman legion over the phalanx, a lesson that would echo for centuries. No longer would tightly packed spears dominate the field. Flexibility, discipline, and adaptability were the new kings of war. Culturally, the fall of Macedon brought Greece into Rome's orbit. Greek art, philosophy, and literature flowed westward, enriching Roman life. The conquerors became the pupils of the conquered, and in time, the fusion of Greek and Roman culture would create the foundation of Western civilization. Yet for those who had stood in the phalanx that day at Pydna, or who had watched their king dragged in chains, the memory was bitter. To them, it was the day freedom died, the day the dream of a Greek world ended. When Lucius Aemilius Paullus stood upon the blood-soaked plain of Pydna, he knew he had changed the course of history. He later told his men, "It was not Rome that won this day, but discipline, patience, and the gods' favor." Let us remember that hubris destroys kings, but unity builds empires. The Battle of Pydna was not merely a clash of arms, but a turning point in human history. In the ruins of Macedon's defeat, Rome rose as the master of the Mediterranean, setting in motion the events that would lead to centuries of Roman dominion. The destinies of two worlds had collided on that fateful day in 168 BCE, and from the dust, Rome's empire was born.